What if I told you that before the Philippines existed, there was an empire so wealthy it made European kingdoms look like peasant villages? An empire that traded with China when Europe was still in the Dark Ages. An empire that built cities of gold while London was just a muddy settlement. This empire wasn't in Egypt or Mesopotamia. It was right here, in the islands we now call the Philippines. And its story has been deliberately erased from history books. But here's the shocking part. We're about to uncover evidence that will change everything you think you know about Southeast Asian civilization. Picture this, the year is 982 AD. Viking raids terrorize Europe. The Byzantine Empire struggles to survive. Most of the world lives in darkness and ignorance. But in the South China Sea, massive ships with golden sails glide through crystal waters. These aren't crude fishing boats. They're engineering marvels that dwarf anything Europe will build for another 500 years. And this is where our story begins, not with Spanish conquest in 1565, but with a civilization that was already ancient when Europe was just beginning to wake up. Meet Raja Suleiman. The name might sound familiar if you know Manila's history, but what nobody tells you is that Suleiman wasn't just a local chief. He was the heir to a royal dynasty that had ruled for over 600 years. When Spanish conquistador Miguel López de Legazpi first laid eyes on Manila in 1571, he expected to find a primitive fishing village. Instead, he found something that left him speechless, a city that rivaled anything in Europe. Stone fortifications that stretched for miles. Wooden palaces inlaid with gold and precious stone. Markets where merchants spoke a dozen languages, trading silks from China, spices from Indonesia, and treasures that Europeans had never seen. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just Manila. Across the archipelago, dozens of sophisticated kingdoms thrived with complex political systems, international trade networks, and cultural achievements that would make Renaissance Italy jealous. And this is where everything changes. Because the Spanish didn't just conquer the Philippines. They systematically destroyed evidence of these civilizations to justify their colonial narrative. After all, how do you claim you're bringing civilization to people who were already more civilized than you? Let's travel back to the year 900 AD. Charlemagne has been dead for a century. England is a collection of warring tribes. Most Europeans can't read or write, but in the Laguna Copperplate, we find something extraordinary, a legal document written in perfect Sanskrit, referencing complex debt settlements, official titles, and a sophisticated judicial system. This isn't just any document. It's proof that by 900 AD, Filipino kingdoms had developed legal systems so advanced, they were conducting international commerce with written contracts when most of the world still operated on handshake deals. But what nobody tells you is what this document really reveals about the kingdom that created it. The Kingdom of Tondo wasn't just another small settlement. It was the hub of a trading empire that connected China to the Malay world, India to Borneo. Their merchants didn't just trade goods, they traded ideas, technologies, and cultural innovations across half the known world. And here's the twist that will blow your mind. Archaeological evidence suggests that Tondo's influence reached as far as the coast of California. Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan reaches the Philippines in 1521, expecting to find isolated island tribes. Instead, he encounters something that changes the course of world history. The Raja of Cebu doesn't just speak to Magellan in one language. He conducts negotiations in Malay, Arabic, Sanskrit, and Chinese. His court includes advisors from India, merchants from Java, and scholars who can read astronomical charts that accurately predict solar eclipses. Magellan's chaplain, Antonio Pigafetta, writes in his journal, "These people possess knowledge of navigation and commerce that surpasses many European courts. Their cities are more orderly than Venice, their palaces more beautiful than those of Seville." But here's the shocking part, most of these journals were later edited or destroyed by Spanish colonial authorities. Because admitting the sophistication of Filipino kingdoms would undermine the entire justification for conquest. How do you claim you're civilizing savages when the savages have better urban planning than Madrid? Let's dive deeper into a kingdom that will shatter every assumption you have about pre-colonial Southeast Asia. The Rajanate of Butuan, located in what is now Mindanao, wasn't just wealthy, it was outrageously wealthy. Archaeological excavations have uncovered gold artifacts that weigh more than entire European royal treasury. But what nobody tells you is why Butuan had so much gold. They weren't just mining it, they were manufacturing it into currency for international trade. Butuan's goldsmiths had developed refining techniques so advanced, Chinese emperors specifically requested Butuan gold for imperial ceremony. And this is where the story takes an incredible turn. In 1001 AD, delegation from Butuan arrives at the Chinese imperial court. They are not coming as tributaries or supplicants. They are arriving as diplomatic equals, bearing gifts that astound Chinese nobles who thought their empire was the center of civilization. The Chinese chronicles describe Butuan's envoys as wearing robes embedded with pearls larger than birds' eggs, carrying ceremonial weapons inlaid with gems unknown to Chinese jewelers. Emperor Zhenzong of Song doesn't just receive them politely, he grants them exclusive trading privileges that he denies to most other foreign kingdoms. But here's where it gets truly extraordinary. The Butuan envoys don't just bring gold and gems. They bring maps that show sea routes across the Pacific that European explorers won't discover for another 500 years. These maps suggest something that will revolutionize our understanding of pre-colonial maritime technology. Filipino navigators were crossing the Pacific regularly, possibly reaching the Americas centuries before Columbus ever set foot on a European ship. And this brings us to the most controversial discovery of all. Recent archaeological evidence from Peru has uncovered artifacts with distinctly Filipino design elements, dated to the 12th century. Pottery styles that match those found in Mindanao. Gold working techniques identical to those used in Butuan. Could Filipino kingdoms have established trans-Pacific trade routes 300 years before Europeans even knew the Pacific Ocean existed? But what nobody tells you is that this evidence has been quietly suppressed by academic institutions that can't reconcile these findings with established historical narratives. Because if Filipino navigators were crossing the Pacific in the 12th century, everything we know about the age of exploration becomes a lie. Let's travel north to a kingdom that perfected something Europeans wouldn't achieve for another 400 years, religious tolerance. The Kingdom of Manila wasn't just multicultural, it was multi-religious. Hindu temples stood beside Islamic mosques, which neighbored indigenous spiritual sites. Buddhist merchants, Christian traders, and local shamans all conducted business in the same markets. Raja Suleiman, the ruler who would later face Spanish conquest, wasn't just Muslim. He was a patron of all religions, funding Hindu festivals, Islamic schools, and indigenous ceremonies with equal generosity. But here's the shocking part: Spanish missionaries were horrified by this tolerance. Father Juan de Plasencia writes to the Spanish crown, "These heathens show such dangerous acceptance of false religions that they threaten the very foundation of Christian supremacy. They must be corrected through force if necessary." And this is where we understand the true motivation behind Spanish colonization. It wasn't about spreading Christianity to godless pagans. It was about destroying sophisticated societies that had achieved religious harmony centuries before the Spanish Inquisition would end. The Spanish didn't bring civilization to the Philippines. They brought religious warfare to a region that had solved the problem of religious conflict before European Christians stopped burning each other at the stake. But what nobody tells you is how advanced these kingdoms were in terms of women's rights. While European women were considered property of their husbands, Filipino kingdoms had female rulers, female merchants, female warriors, and female priests who wielded significant political power. The Spanish were shocked to discover that in many Filipino kingdoms, inheritance passed through the maternal line, women could divorce freely, and female scholars debated philosophy in royal courts. And this brings us to the most powerful woman in pre-colonial Philippine history. Meet Princess Urduja of Pangasinan, a ruler whose military prowess terrified Chinese admirals and whose diplomatic skills impressed Javanese Sultan. Marco Polo himself writes about encountering Urduja during his travels, describing her as commanding a fleet of warships and an army of female warriors that could defeat any male-led force in Southeast Asia. But here's where the story becomes legend. When Mongol fleets, the same fleets that conquered most of Asia, attempted to invade Pangasinan, Urduja didn't just repel them. She captured their admiral and forced the Mongol Empire to negotiate for his release. The Mongols, who had conquered China, Russia, and half of Europe, were forced to recognize Pangasinan as an independent equal rather than a tributary state. And this is where everything changes about how we understand medieval military power. Because Urduja's victory over the Mongols wasn't luck or geography, it was superior naval technology, better intelligence networks, and more innovative battle tactics. Filipino kingdoms hadn't just developed advanced trade and culture, they had created military innovations that could defeat the most feared army in the world. But what nobody tells you is why these stories disappeared from history. When Spanish colonizers arrived, they found societies more advanced than their own in many ways. Filipino kingdoms had better sanitation systems than European cities. They had more efficient agricultural techniques. They had more equitable legal systems. Admitting this would have undermined the entire colonial project. So Spanish chroniclers did something unprecedented. They rewrote history while it was still happening. They described advanced Filipino cities as primitive settlements. They called sophisticated political systems anarchic tribalism. They transformed evidence of Filipino achievement into proof of Filipino inferiority. And this systematic distortion continued for over 300 years. But archaeological evidence doesn't lie. And what we're discovering is revolutionizing our understanding of Southeast Asian civilization. Recent excavations in Butuan have uncovered workshops where artisans were creating mechanical devices, gears, springs, precision instruments, that European technology wouldn't match until the Renaissance. Carbon dating of these artifacts proves they were created in the 13th century, over 200 years before similar technologies appeared in Europe. And this is where our story reaches its most mind-bending revelation. Filipino kingdoms weren't just participating in world civilization. In many ways, they were leading it. While Europe struggled through the Dark Ages, Filipino scholars were translating Sanskrit texts, Islamic mathematics, and Chinese astronomy into local languages. They were creating hybrid technologies that combined innovations from across Asia into systems more advanced than their individual components. But here's the twist that changes everything about how we see pre-colonial Philippines. These kingdoms didn't just trade with the known world. They were creating the known world. Filipino navigators mapped sea routes that connected civilizations across 3 continents. Their merchants established trading posts from Madagascar to Mexico. Their scholars translated knowledge between languages and cultures, serving as the internet of the medieval world. And when Spanish conquistadors arrived, they found not primitive tribes, but the remnants of a sophisticated international network that had been operating successfully for over 600 years. But what nobody tells you is what happened to all that knowledge. Spanish authorities systematically destroyed Filipino libraries, burned scholarly texts, and executed intellectuals who refused to abandon their learning for Christian doctrine. The Library of Butuan, which Spanish records describe as containing texts in 12 languages covering subjects unknown to European universities, was completely destroyed in 1578. The Royal Archives of Tondo, which included diplomatic correspondence with Chinese emperors, Javanese sultans, and Indian rajas, were burned in 1582. Thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, destroyed in a matter of decades. And this brings us to the most heartbreaking part of our story. By 1600, the generation that remembered the great Filipino kingdoms was dying. Their children, raised under Spanish rule, were taught to believe their ancestors had been ignorant savages saved by European civilization. The amnesia was so complete that within 100 years, Filipinos themselves began to believe Spanish propaganda about their own history. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because Filipino cultural DNA preserved what Spanish destruction couldn't eliminate. The bayanihan spirit that modern Filipinos celebrate, that's the remnant of sophisticated community organization systems developed by ancient Filipino kingdom. The Filipino emphasis on extended family relationship, that's the echo of complex kinship networks that held kingdoms together across vast distances. The Filipino talent for music, art, and craftsmanship, those are genetic memories of courts where artists and scholars were valued more highly than warriors. And this is where we discover something profound about cultural resilience. You can destroy books, burn buildings, and execute scholars, but you can't eliminate the fundamental character that allowed a civilization to flourish for over 600 years. Modern Filipino success in international business, their skill at building diaspora networks, their ability to adapt and thrive in foreign cultures, these aren't accidents. They are the reawakening of abilities that made their ancestors masters of medieval international commerce. But what nobody tells you is that this reawakening is accelerating. Filipino Americans are discovering their pre-colonial heritage and demanding that history books be rewritten. Filipino archaeologists are uncovering evidence that's forcing international scholars to revise their understanding of Southeast Asian civilizations. Filipino artists are recreating the aesthetic traditions that Spanish authorities tried to destroy. Filipino writers are retelling the stories that colonialism tried to erase. And this brings us to the most important revelation of all. The forgotten kingdoms of 9001565 weren't just historical curiosity. They were proof of what Filipinos could achieve when they controlled their own destiny. They built cities that rivaled anything in the world. They created technologies that were centuries ahead of their time. They established trade networks that spanned continents. They developed political systems that balanced individual freedom with community responsibility. They did all of this while maintaining religious tolerance, gender equality, and environmental sustainability that modern societies are still trying to achieve. And this is where our story becomes a prophecy rather than just history. Because if Filipinos could create such sophisticated civilizations with medieval technology, imagine what they can achieve with modern resources. If they could establish international trade networks using wooden ships and star navigation, imagine their potential with digital technology and global communication. If they could create art, literature, and music that impressed Chinese emperors and Javanese sultans, imagine their cultural contributions to a world that finally recognizes their heritage. But here's the final twist that makes this story urgently relevant. The same forces that destroyed the Filipino kingdoms are still operating today. The same mentality that justified colonial conquest now justifies economic exploitation. The same propaganda that depicted advanced civilizations as primitive now depicts developing nations as backward. Understanding the true history of pre-colonial Philippines isn't just about correcting historical records. It's about recognizing that the narratives we're told about civilization, progress, and cultural superiority are often designed to justify contemporary forms of domination. And this brings us to the most powerful lesson from the Forgotten Kingdom. Civilization doesn't flow from one center to the rest of the world. It emerges wherever human communities develop the wisdom to balance individual achievement with collective responsibility, local identity with international cooperation, technological innovation with environmental harmony. The kingdoms of 9001565 proved that this balance was possible. They created societies that were more humane, more sustainable, and more beautiful than most of what followed. Their destruction wasn't the inevitable result of Spanish superiority. It was the tragic consequence of military technology being used to destroy social technology. But social technology can be recreated. The wisdom that built great kingdoms can build them again. And this is where the forgotten becomes the future. Because every Filipino who learns this history, every scholar who uncovers this evidence, every artist who recreates this beauty is participating in the resurrection of civilizations that were interrupted but never truly ended. The kingdoms of Tondo, Butuan, Manila, and Pangasinan weren't just historical experiments. They were previews of what human societies can become when they are organized around wisdom rather than conquest, cooperation rather than domination, creativity rather than destruction. Their story isn't over. It was just paused for 450 years. And now, as the world faces challenges that require exactly the kind of wisdom these kingdoms developed, environmental crisis, religious conflict, economic inequality, cultural fragmentation, their example becomes more relevant than ever. What if the future doesn't lie in trying to recreate European or American models of success? What if it lies in remembering and updating the models that flourished in these islands for over 6 centuries? What if the Philippines' destiny isn't to become like other nations, but to remember what it means to be Filipino in the deepest sense, heirs to kingdoms that solved problems the world is still struggling with? The Spanish thought they were ending a story when they conquered the Philippines. But they were just creating an intermission. The real story, the story of what Filipino civilization can achieve, is just beginning to unfold again. And that story belongs not just to the Philippines, but to anyone who believes that human societies can be organized around wisdom, beauty, and mutual flourishing rather than fear, greed, and domination. The Forgotten Kingdoms are calling us to remember what we're capable of when we refuse to let others define our possibility. Their legacy isn't in the past, it's in the